Hi, it's a great pleasure to have with me today Matt Callahan, who's the Executive Director of the ASX-listed Botanix. Now, Botanix is a specialist in the synthetic cannabinoid sector, and it's focused particularly on dermatological conditions. But I've got Matt here to tell me more, and he's come all the way from Philadelphia, so it's much appreciated. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks, Tim. Pleasure to be here, and it's nice to be back in Australia after a very long time.
So Botanix, just to explain to listeners generally, your therapeutics are based on synthetic cannabinoids as opposed to the green stuff which grows in the soil, and you're targeting dermatological applications. Perhaps you could just outline where you're at with each of these indications?
Sure. So Botanix was founded to address a number of common dermatological indications. So you've mentioned, acne and rosacea and these sorts of diseases. And we do use a synthetic form of CBD. And as you mentioned, originally that was identified in the plant, but we use a fully synthetic version of that comes from a pharmaceutical plant. So what we're doing with Botanix is we're developing a range of products based on synthetic CBD, obviously, for common dermatological conditions. And our focus is not so much on the agent that we use, so the drug that we're developing, but the diseases that we can actually address. And we have a technology platform behind that allows us to deliver different sorts of drugs, including synthetic CBD, into the skin very effectively. So from a development point of view, we are at phase 2, going into phase 3 with many of our programs. And the next few months in particular will be very important for the company because we have a number of studies reading out. And we also have a number of other corporate activities underway at the moment, which we think will probably catapult the company into the next stage of our development. So it's a very exciting time.
Are you most advanced with the acne program?
We are. So we completed a phase 2 study in acne about 24 months ago. We then took that program down to the FDA to kind of design and validate our phase 3 studies, which was very successful. Probably the next most mature one is our rosacea program. So we're in the midst at the moment of recruiting patients for our phase 1b/2 study. We aim to have that fully recruited by the middle of this year, with data we've said to the market in Q3. And then behind that we have a dermatitis program, which we'll have some data from next quarter. And as you mentioned, we're obviously working in bacterial infections as well.
Now they're all sort of really big markets, obviously, but particularly acne, which kind of affects almost every adolescent on the planet. So why hasn't anyone else to date devised something better? I mean, there hasn't sort of been a new treatment for several decades.
Yeah, that's right, and it's kind of one of those strange things, and it's not through lack of trying.
Yeah.
So as you mentioned, particularly in acne and rosacea, there's been no new products with a different mechanism of action approved in more than 20 years. So we still have at one end the antimicrobials to deal with the P. acnes or the Cutibacterium bacteria, and things like topical anti-inflammatories. And at the other, more severe end, we have things like Accutane or Roaccutane, which many severe patients take, but come with serious side effects, things like suicidal ideation and burning and stinging and peeling of the face. So that kind of middle ground for the kind of moderate to severe patients has really been unaddressed with anything that's new. And one of the things that we love about synthetic CBD particularly is that it's both antimicrobial and it's anti-inflammatory. So you kind of get two drugs together in one piece, and it's very, very safe. So we've been in more than 800 or 900 patients in different clinical studies, and we don't see serious side effects or really any side effects with the drugs that we've been treating. So it gives us great hope because in dermatology, it's really about safety first because we're applying these drugs to our face. Efficacy is obviously very important as well, but safety really is a primary concern.
How do you measure success? in terms of the endpoints?
Yeah, so the good news about that is in dermatology, they're fairly well-trodden paths. So in many cases, FDA has issued guidances which say to run a registrational study or a phase 3 study, you have to do these certain things to get approval. To give you an example, in acne, that's usually focused on looking at a thing called IGA, or an Investigator's Global Assessment, which is a standard scale that all dermatologists use, and actually counting pimples. So we count pimples at the start of the study, we count pimples at the end of the study. The difference between the two is success or failure. So, unlike some other areas where it's highly subjective as to whether your drug has been successful, here you can see it and you can literally count the difference.
Does it make a difference if they're blackheads or whiteheads? Or?
Yeah, it does. In fact, they count them separately. And so it's a really interesting thing when you're doing studies like this. Many dermatologists have been treating patients for a long period of time, but we have to teach them a way of counting pimples on the face. We also have to teach them a way of assessing that kind of condition. So as an example, in our rosacea study, we've kind of taken that to the next level where we're using some technology to actually help introduce almost an objective standard into the studies that we're doing. So we're using a piece of technology which is made by a company in the US called Canfield. And that technology is kind of a multitude of cameras, all in kind of almost like a box, with controlled lighting conditions, which allows us to take the same picture of the same person's face every time they come in. So not only is that imagery being used to kind of assess patients into the study, it's also being used to help assess outcomes from the study, and we have an independent assessor associated with that study as well. So for the first time, we've kind of got both a record, but also an independent arbiter on the study, which kind of helps with study quality and ultimately helps in the education of the physicians involved in those studies.
Okay. And Matt, what's your strategy in terms of approval? Are you targeting the FDA and sort of obviously the largest market, the US?
Yeah, so obviously the US accounts for a bit more than 80% of the total value of pharmaceuticals in the world, right? So a combination of patient population and pricing. And so our strategy is very FDA focused. So we'll get approval first in the US and then obviously expand that out into other markets around the world. And it's a really important point because with the diseases that we're going after, because it is dermatology, most patients start with treatments that they buy themselves to treat themselves. So, we all go down to the chemist and we might buy an antimicrobial drug or some sort of topical anti-inflammatory. But as your disease gets more severe, you need something that's more powerful, and often those drugs that are more powerful come with more side effects. So that's why they are prescribed by physicians. You're under the guidance of a dermatologist or a general practitioner. And so we want to actually do clinical studies that provide data that ultimately convince FDA to approve the product as safe and effective, and probably more importantly, to convince insurers or payers in the US that they should reimburse our product as opposed to kind of giving them either a generic product or something that they buy themselves. So we have to generate that data set, and really the only way to do that is to do clinical studies.
Okay, but you're confident of reimbursement in the US from the sounds of things?
Yeah, so we do a lot of work, and kind of one of the experiences that I've been fortunate to have, having lived in the US for a bit more than 10 years now, is the process of preparing a product for market before you have even your phase 3 data, and certainly before you have your approval. Because there are lots of people developing drugs at any one time, and you have to convince the payers, who ultimately are the people who are the gatekeeper to your product, that your product does something that's useful, safe and effective, but also you have to convince the physicians that the product is better than potentially something else that's out there at the time. And so that process takes 12 months to 18 months to 2 years to do well. And so our approach very much is always looking at the market, looking at the reimbursement pathway and making sure that that makes sense at the end of the day, because if that doesn't make sense, no end of clinical data is going to help you in terms of actually generating a profit or generating a shareholder return from a product.
It's interesting with Botanix and its sort of positioning in the ASX. I guess you might be perceived as sort of part of the pot stock cohort, but a lot of your offering is about the delivery system, the Permatrex, if I've got that right.
You have, yes.
Yep, good. Which is about making sure the topical ointment gets under the skin, because the skin's sort of made to keep things out.
That's right.
It's very good at it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's the barrier, obviously, that protects our body. So having a technology that drives drug into the skin effectively, and certainly more effectively than the traditional approach, is a big advantage. But to your point, I think our approach has always been a pharmaceutical one, right? So it's really an accident of history that synthetic CBD, the form of CBD, was found in the cannabis plant. We've never positioned ourselves as a pot stock. For us, it's just a really interesting, really appropriate drug for the treatment of dermatology. That's why we use a fully synthetic version of it. And at the end of the day, it's the data that talks, right? So we don't have any mystery around an entourage effect or combining different kind of parts of the plant together. That's kind of completely irrelevant to what we're doing. So it's really, does this drug work to treat a disease? If it does it do it well enough to ultimately get FDA approval and reimbursement?
Sure, and that's the aim of the game. Matt, as a US-based executive of a ASX-based company, how do you sort of see the market at the moment, which has been very tough for biotechs? You know, some of them on the Nasdaq have lost half their value, even though they're just as good a company as they were a couple of months ago. Some are trading below cash backing, etc., etc. The market sort of hasn't been very kind to your share price. What's sort of happening out there? What's your perspective on things?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting time, and as we know, US biotech market started to come off in the last quarter of last year. So, there's about 150 IPOs in the biotech space last year, probably 5, I think, in the last quarter of last year. And so from an overall value perspective, the market has kind of shifted away from the generalist funds investing in biotech, and it's kind of moving back towards those specialist funds, which ultimately we think is a good thing. In terms of the opportunities that creates, that's probably the most interesting area, because, as you say, there are a number of companies, even in the dermatology space, who have very interesting assets, but no cash and no ability to raise cash to progress those assets. And we have been hunting for opportunities to add to our own pipeline, which kind of makes sense and are complementary within the dermatology space. And we've kind of kissed a lot of frogs. And so obviously our hope as we kind of go through these processes is that we find something that kind of makes good sense in the context of our pipeline, and really looks to leapfrog us into more of a commercial company. So if you look at the management of Botanix with guys like Vince Ippolito, who's our president and chairman, he's launched more than 30 dermatology products. He sold his last company for a bit more than $5 billion to Pfizer based on a phase 3, approved dermatology product. So we've got a great team, to use the analogy, sitting on the bench, and we want to get them into the game. And a great way to get them into the game is with some late stage products near to revenue generation. And that will be very transformative for us as a company, kind of changing us from, a relatively early to mid-stage research and development company into a commercial company basically overnight. So we're looking at a lot of opportunities. We hope to be able to bring something home in the near future, and that certainly would be a really important value inflection point for the company.
Okay, and funding-wise, you've got the cash there if you do kiss these frogs and they turn into princesses.
Absolutely, yeah. So we've been very fortunate, and I think we've been good stewards of the cash that we've raised historically from a shareholder perspective. So we've got about $16.8 million in the bank from the last quarterly, about another 3 or so coming back from the R&D tax in the coming weeks. We obviously don't want to spend a lot of that money on these potential acquisitions that are kind of complementary to our business, but where there are opportunities, we will do that. And obviously our goal is to continue to progress our internal pipeline. We're big believers in that, and we're getting close to the point, within the coming weeks and months where we're generating data from that pipeline. So we expect to see a good, obviously value appreciation as we deliver data, because that's really the most important thing.
What should investors be looking out for? It sounds like there's obviously sort of the ongoing clinical work and potential acquisitions from the sounds of things.
Yeah, so from a clinical perspective, we've got our dermatitis study, a canine dermatitis study that should read out next quarter. We're just finishing the enrolment for that study now. The rosacea study will complete enrolment in Q2 of this year. We've said to the market we'll have that data for them in Q3. That's a really important inflection point for us as well. And then within the next few weeks, we'll be kicking off our antimicrobial study, which we'll be doing here in Australia, which is a phase 2 study. And that will be finished, we plan, by the end of this year as well. So 3 data readouts in the course of this year. And then, as you mentioned, we're constantly on the outlook for really good opportunities, and other people's misfortune in the US market can be our benefit. So we'll continue to look for those opportunities and look to do something that's transformational.
Thanks, Matt. That's very informative, and we look forward to hearing more about your programs in coming months.
Thanks, Tim, and appreciate the time.